The first formations of Japanese carrier aircraft crossed the reef line at 0630, and the defense battalion's gunners opened up without hesitation. A furious 17-minute action erupted over the lagoon, the sky torn open by the steady hammer of automatic weapons and the deeper concussion of 3-inch shells detonating among the enemy planes. Smoke boiled from burning fuel storage tanks, and fragments of metal whistled downward into the sand. Despite the chaos, the gun crews held their positions, ammunition handlers feeding rounds through the haze as aircraft with red discs on their wings tumbled into the Pacific. It was a brutal introduction to the war these men had been trained to fight. But how had such a specialized force come to be standing guard over this tiny speck of land in the vastness of the Central Pacific? The answer lay years earlier, in the looming shadow of Japanese expansionism and a series of color-coded war plans drawn up by a navy that foresaw the need to seize and hold advanced bases across thousands of miles of open water. To protect those bases, the Marine Corps would have to create something entirely new, a unit equipped not just for offense, but for the grinding, unglamorous work of digging in and holding ground against attack from sea and sky. In the autumn of 1939, the Commandant of the Marine Corps set that process in motion. Major General Thomas Holcomb, a trim officer with a meticulous mind for organizational detail, understood that Congress would not easily fund offensive units while the nation still clung to its isolationist mood. Yet the Navy's Orange plans demanded Marines who could occupy an undefended spit of coral, and within days transform it into a bristling fortress. Holcomb therefore authorized the formation of the 1st Defense Battalions, each roughly 900 men, organized around batteries of 5-inch coastal guns and 3-inch anti-aircraft pieces. At Headquarters Marine Corps, 2 officers took the lead in translating this concept into reality. Colonel Charles D. Barrett, a veteran of Vera Cruz, and Colonel Robert H. Pepper labored over tables of organization that blended heavy artillery, machine guns, searchlights, and a then-secret technology called radar into a single combined arms team. What emerged from their planning was a unit of extraordinary firepower for its size, able, in the words of a classified document drafted by Lieutenant Robert D. Heinel in 1940, to serve as a sort of expeditionary coast artillery capable of occupying an untenanted and undefended locality. Within 3 days, Heinel's paper, circulated throughout the Corps, emphasized the battalion's technical specialists, the men who could maintain temperamental searchlight generators, tune complex radio sets, and coax a radar into tracking aircraft through tropical humidity. By the summer of 1940, the Commandant could report to the Secretary of the Navy that 4 of these battalions were already established, with 2 more authorized, and fleet commanders were asking for additional units. The Marine Corps had built a defensive weapon that, as one officer later observed, could configure itself like an erector set for whatever job the next war demanded. Over the next year, those battalions fanned out across the globe, under the operational plan known as Rainbow 5. Colonel Harry K. Pickett's 3rd Defense Battalion landed on Midway Atoll in late September 1940, manning positions on sandy islands inhabited, as one Marine noted, by more than 1 million birds. The 7th Defense Battalion, a composite unit packing infantry, alongside its artillery, steamed into Tutuila, American Samoa, in March 1941, becoming the first element of the Fleet Marine Force to deploy into the Southern Hemisphere during the emergency. Detachments from the 1st Defense Battalion took station on Johnston and Palmyra Islands, while a larger slice of that same battalion struggled ashore at Wake. Far to the north, the 5th Defense Battalion arrived in Iceland to relieve British troops guarding the vital sea lanes, and the 4th set up its weapons on the rocky hills above Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. From the Arctic to the equator, the defense battalions were now in place, a thin but determined shield of Marine gunners watching a world sliding toward war. The first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor at 7:55 on the morning of December 7th. Amid the shriek of diving aircraft and the thunder of explosions, Marines of the 1st, 3rd, and 4th Defense Battalions scrambled to their battle stations across the harbor and the Marine Barracks parade ground. Most of their heavy weapons remained stored on shipboard, the ammunition crated and inaccessible. Within 6 minutes, the gunners had 8 anti-aircraft machine guns in action, the barrels swinging skyward as the second wave of Japanese aircraft began its run. By 8:20, 13 machine guns were manned and firing, their tracers arcing into the smoke-filled sky. The 3-inch anti-aircraft batteries, however, sat silent and useless. The shells for those weapons simply had not reached the firing positions. Marine riflemen raised their Springfields and fired at the streaking shapes overhead, a gesture of defiance that did little to stop the onslaught. When the final Japanese aircraft departed, the Defense Battalion Marines had fired 25 machine guns and claimed 3 enemy planes destroyed, but the cost was staggering. 18 ships sunk or damaged, more than 200 aircraft wrecked, over 2,300 Americans dead. That same night, shortly before midnight, a pair of Japanese destroyers closed on Midway Island and began shelling Sand Island. The 6th Defense Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Harold D. Shannon, had taken over the atoll's defenses from the 3rd Defense Battalion weeks earlier. One of the first salvos slammed into the power plant that housed the battalion's command post. The blast tore through concrete and steel, severing communications lines and wounding several Marines. Among them was First Lieutenant George H. Cannon, the battalion's communications officer, who absorbed the full force of the detonation. Cannon lay grievously wounded, his body broken by shell fragments, yet he refused evacuation. He directed the other wounded to be cared for first, then turned his attention to the shattered switchboard. Beside him, Corporal Harold Hazelwood worked urgently to splice the severed lines and restore the battalion's communications network. Cannon remained conscious, issuing instructions in a voice that grew steadily weaker until Hazelwood finally re-established the circuit. Only then did the lieutenant allow himself to be moved. He died of his wounds soon afterward, the first Marine officer in World War II to receive the Medal of Honor, and Hazelwood received the Navy Cross for his own courage under fire. Far to the southwest, at Wake Island, the Marines had no radar, no sound-ranging equipment, and no illusions about their isolation. The detachment of the 1st Defense Battalion, some 400 men strong, had endured savage air attacks since December 8th. The Japanese bombers arriving daily to crater the airstrip and kill the few fighter planes that rose to meet them. The men relied on optical spotters and their own eyes to track the enemy formations as they emerged from the morning sun. On December 11th, those spotters saw something new on the horizon, a Japanese invasion force. 3 cruisers and their escorting destroyers, with 2 troop transports in convoy. Major George H. Potter commanded Wake's coastal defense batteries, and he understood the stakes with brutal clarity. His 5-inch naval guns, emplaced in sandbagged revetments along the shoreline, were the only weapons on the island that could reach the approaching warships. Potter held his fire, letting the Japanese close the range, waiting until the ships were well within the kill zone. When he finally gave the order, the big guns erupted. Shell after shell tore into the Japanese formation, scoring hits on multiple cruisers. One warship took a direct hit amidships, smoke boiling from its shattered hull. The Japanese commander had expected a pulverized garrison incapable of resistance. Instead, he faced accurate, devastating fire from guns that should have been destroyed days earlier. The invasion force turned away, the damaged cruisers limping back toward the open sea, the transports never reaching the reef. Ashore, Captain Bright D. Godbold's 3-inch anti-aircraft group had already bloodied the Japanese air raids, claiming multiple bombers during the preceding days. His gunners had learned to lead their targets by instinct, adjusting their fire without the sophisticated directors that larger bases enjoyed. Technical Sergeant Charles A. Holmes, a fire control specialist on Wake, later reflected that radar would never have changed the outcome of the siege. The set itself, he believed, might have fallen into Japanese hands intact, yielding useful intelligence about the secret technology. What mattered on Wake was not electronics but sheer grit, the willingness of gunners to stay at their weapons while bombs cratered the coral around them, while strafing fighters killed the men beside them. The island's defenders had no illusions. They knew they were fighting a losing battle, but they had already done what no one expected. They had stopped an invasion cold. The Japanese High Command responded to the humiliation of December 11th with a relentless escalation of the air campaign. Day after day, the bombers came, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times before sunset. The remaining Marine fighters were picked off one by one, shot down over the lagoon or destroyed on the ground. The anti-aircraft gun crews took the brunt of the punishment, the Japanese pilots targeting their positions with increasing precision. Casualties mounted, but the Marines stayed at their weapons. Those not needed at battle stations were, in the words of one survivor, hot-footing it for shelter, diving into slit trenches as the bombs walked across the atoll. Commander Winfield S. Cunningham, the naval base commander on Wake, watched his garrison shrink under the weight of the attacks. The 5-inch guns that had turned back the invasion force still functioned, but their crews were depleted, their ammunition finite. Every man on the island knew the arithmetic. There would be no relief expedition, no carrier task force steaming to the rescue. A relief force had been organized, had even sorted from Pearl Harbor, but it would never arrive in time. The defenders of Wake were alone, and they knew it. By December 22nd, the pattern of the siege had become a grim routine of survival. The Japanese aircraft would appear at dawn, their engines a rising drone over the lagoon, and the gunners would open fire until the barrels glowed. The bombers would depart, leaving fresh craters and fresh casualties. The survivors would emerge from their holes, patch their wounds, bury their dead, repair what could be repaired. At night, the men strained their eyes toward the ocean, knowing that the next invasion force was assembling beyond the horizon. They did not know when it would come, only that it would. The Japanese assault force that approached Wake on the night of December 22nd was larger, better armed, and determined not to repeat the mistakes of the 11th. 2 light transports carried special naval landing force troops, men trained to storm fortified beaches under fire. Self-propelled landing barges churned toward the reef in the darkness. The Marines on Wake heard the engines first, then saw the dark shapes moving against the phosphorescent surf. The final battle for the island was about to begin, and every man on the Coral knew there would be no withdrawal this time. The Japanese barges ground onto the reef in the pre-dawn darkness of December 23rd, and the Special Naval Landing Force troops scrambled ashore under a torrent of automatic weapons fire. The Marines met them at the water's edge with rifles, machine guns, and the last rounds of the 3-inch batteries fired at point-blank range. The fighting dissolved into a bitter close-quarters struggle, the defenders contesting every sandbagged position, every blasted bunker, every coral outcropping. Artillerymen who had served their guns through weeks of bombing now fought as infantry, exchanging rifle fire with the waves of Japanese pouring across the reef. 2 Japanese transports beached themselves directly on the reef, disgorging more troops into the maelstrom. The Marine gun crews fired until their ammunition was exhausted, then grabbed rifles, bayonets, anything that could serve as a weapon. Major Potter's coastal guns, silent now for lack of targets, became the scene of desperate hand-to-hand fighting. Captain Godbold's anti-aircraft gunners, who had claimed aircraft after aircraft during the siege, turned their remaining small arms against the infantry assault. Hundreds of Japanese fell in the furious exchange, but the numbers were inexorable by mid-morning. The tactical situation had become hopeless. The Japanese had established a firm beachhead, their troops fanning out across the atoll, overwhelming isolated pockets of resistance. Communications between the scattered positions had broken down, and the ammunition for the heavy weapons was exhausted. Commander Cunningham, assessing the situation from his battered command post, faced an agonizing choice: continue a fight that could only end in the annihilation of his garrison, or preserve the lives of the men who had already fought far beyond what any strategist had imagined possible. He ordered the surrender. The 400-man Marine detachment, including the defenders of the Defense Battalion elements, laid down their arms and were taken into captivity. They had held Wake Island for 15 days against overwhelming air and naval power, sinking 1 warship with aerial bombs and another with coastal artillery, inflicting hundreds of casualties on the Japanese landing force. Across the Pacific, from Pearl Harbor to Midway to Wake, the defense battalions had absorbed the first shock of war and fought back with whatever they had. The lesson of those desperate days was stark. Static defense without relief was death, but a properly armed and determined garrison could exact a terrible price from the attacker. In the bitter January weeks that follow the fall of Wake Island, the Pacific strategic map looks to the senior officers at Headquarters Marine Corps like a crescent of broken glass. To the southwest, the Japanese are driving down the Malayan Peninsula towards Singapore, and their naval spearheads are already probing the waters north of Australia. The sea lanes to New Zealand, the lifeline that must carry American troops and Australian wheat alike, run through the Samoan Islands where the 7th Defence Battalion has stood alone since the previous spring. On January 21st, the heavy transports of the 2nd Marine Brigade appear off Tutuila, disgorging a full infantry regiment, artillery, and a fresh defence battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Raymond E. Knapp. The 2nd Defence Battalion disembarks in a clatter of winches and the shouts of stevedores, its 3-inch pieces and machine guns joining the 7th's existing network of emplacements that stare north across the empty Pacific. The labour that follows is unglamorous, exhausting, and absolutely essential. The Marines of both defence battalions, working alongside Samoan labourers and Navy Seabees, string barbed wire across the mangrove swamps, pour concrete for ammunition bunkers, and clear fields of fire through the dense tropical undergrowth. Knapp's gunners learn to wrestle-wield 3-inch anti-aircraft pieces onto platforms built of coral fill and coconut logs. Their sights aligned on the compass bearings from which Japanese long-range flying boats have already been reported. In February, a third unit, the 8th Defense Battalion under Colonel Augustus W. Cockrell, sails farther southwest to the Wallis Islands, a small French possession, and begins digging in there with infantry, tanks, and field artillery attached to stiffen its perimeter. By March, a shield of marine anti-aircraft guns now arcs from Samoa to Wallis, a barrier thrown up across the approaches to the critical South Pacific supply routes. This is not the kind of war that gets written about in the newspapers back home, and the men know it. They sweat through the monotonous days, wrestling crates of ammunition, fighting off clouds of malarial mosquitoes, and staring out at an empty horizon that somehow feels more ominous than any visible enemy. But their presence allows other forces to assemble, and far to the south, in New Zealand, another Marine officer is studying charts of a jungle island few Americans have ever heard of. Major General Alexander A. Vandergrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, is preparing his regiments for the first American amphibious offensive of the war, a thrust into the Solomon Islands that will test everything the Corps has learned about base defense and amphibious assault. The anti-aircraft gunners sweating on Samoa and Wallis are the outer guard that makes his assembly possible. 3,000 miles northwest of Samoa, on Midway Atoll, Lieutenant Colonel Harold D. Shannon's 6th Defense Battalion has spent the spring turning 2 flat sand spits into the most densely armed patch of coral in the Pacific. The lessons of December 7th have been absorbed with brutal focus. The ammunition is now at the guns, not crated on ships. The 3-inch anti-aircraft pieces have been joined by new 37mm automatic cannons, and light tanks, M3 Stuarts with thin armor but quick engines, are dug into revetments along the airstrips. Most critically, a reinforced concrete bunker houses an SCR-270 radar set, whose operators have memorized every electrical quirk of its temperamental oscilloscope. Shannon, a jut-jawed officer who radiates quiet competence, has told his men to keep cool and make their bullets count. By the first week of June, the atoll's garrison numbers 1,700 Marines, a small army packed onto 2 tiny islands that the Japanese fleet has already marked for invasion. The attack inflicts heavy damage. The fuel storage tanks blaze, the hangars burn, and smoke billows thousands of feet into the Pacific sky. But the 6th Defense Battalion keeps fighting, even as bombs crater its gun positions, and by the time the last Japanese aircraft wheels away, the gunners have knocked down 10 of the attackers, a rate of fire and a level of lethality that the enemy commander finds alarming. He orders a second strike, a follow-up that will require his ordnance crews to pull the armor-piercing torpedoes off the decks and replace them with high-explosive bombs. Frantic operation conducted on exposed flight decks. In that moment, as the bombers recede from Midway and the carrier decks below become a chaos of ammunition carts and unprotected fuel lines, American naval aviators from 3 carriers find the Japanese task force and begin their dives. The resistance of the Defense Battalion Marines on Midway, their stubborn, accurate, radar-directed fire that refused to be silenced, has shifted the delicate timing of the battle by perhaps 30 minutes. And 30 minutes is all the difference between a Japanese victory and the destruction of 4 enemy carriers that turned the tide of the Pacific War. The invasion convoy that steams into the Solomon Islands in the first week of August represents everything the defense battalions were originally designed to support, an amphibious offensive to seize a hostile shore and hold it. Colonel Pepper, the officer who helped draft the tables of organization for these units back in 1939, commands the 3rd Defense Battalion, and he rides toward Guadalcanal with the assault waves, not behind them. At Lunga Point, the machine gun and anti-aircraft groups hit the beach almost with the 1st Infantry, their crews sprinting across the dark volcanic sand to set up weapons before Japanese aircraft can respond to the landing. The island itself is a sodden, malarial wilderness of coconut groves, head-high kunai grass, and jungle-covered ridges that rear up from the coastal plain like the spines of some buried creature. Henderson Field, the half-finished Japanese airstrip that is the objective of the entire operation, lies just inland, a scar of reddish earth and crushed coral that the Marines must protect at all costs. The gunners of the 3rd Defense Battalion dig their 90mm anti-aircraft pieces into the mud on either side of the runway, while the Seacoast Artillery Group waits offshore for the transports to bring its heavy 155mm guns through the narrow channel. Corporals and privates who trained as radar technicians now haul ammunition boxes through the surf, their secret knowledge of the temperamental electronic sets temporarily useless until the search and fire control equipment can be unloaded. The Japanese counterattack begins almost immediately. On the afternoon of the first day, twin-engine bombers appear out of the northern sky, their formations tight and disciplined, aiming for the transports still unloading supplies. The 90mm guns of the 3rd Defense Battalion crash into action, their barrels elevating to maximum angle, the 10-man crews working with the frantic rhythm that only live-fire combat can produce. The new Army-designed pieces fire a 23-pound projectile that can reach a ceiling of over 11,000 yards, and the shells burst among the tight formations. 3 bombers tumble into the channel in flames, and the surviving aircraft scatter, their bomb runs disrupted. That night, Japanese destroyers run down the slot and hammer the beachhead with naval gunfire. A psychological assault designed to deny sleep and fray nerves, the shells tearing through the palm fronds and churning the sand into glass. The Seacoast Artillery Group arrives in late August, and the battalion's firepower doubles as the 155mm guns are winched ashore and dragged into position around Lunga Point. When 3 Japanese supply ships attempt to beach themselves on the island's northern shore to land reinforcements, the 155mm battery opens fire from across the sound. The first salvos, directed by forward observers crouching in the jungle, straddle the ships, and the second rounds smash directly into the hulls, setting them ablaze. The Defense Battalion has now established a complete protective ring around Henderson Field. Radar-directed searchlights probing the night sky, 90mm anti-aircraft batteries covering the airspace above the runway, and heavy 155mm guns that can reach out and strike enemy shipping miles offshore. The airstrip remains operational through 6 months of the most violent air and naval counterattacks the Japanese can muster. Nearly a full year passes before the tempo of the Solomons campaign accelerates again, driving the Marines northwestward toward the Japanese fortress at Rabaul. In the summer of 1943, 3 defense battalions, the 9th, 10th, and 11th, are assigned to support the Army's 14th Corps in the assault on New Georgia. The primary objective is Munda Point Airfield, critical Japanese installation that must be captured to provide air cover for the next advance up the slot. The geography of the operation is unforgiving gravel, a tangle of jungle-choked ridges and mangrove swamps, where visibility often extends no farther than the muzzle of a rifle. The landings at Rendova Island, a small anchorage just off the coast of New Georgia, begin on the 30th of June. The assault waves arrive off schedule and out of sequence, the landing craft bunching up in the surf as Japanese machine guns open fire from hidden positions among the palms. Gun crews of the 9th Defense Battalion go over the side, carrying rifles as well as artillery tools, doubling as infantry to clear the light opposition that has survived the naval bombardment. The 155mm howitzers are wrestled ashore through chest-deep water, their massive split-trail carriages sinking into the soft sand until the tractor drivers gun the engines and drag them to solid ground. By nightfall, the heavy guns are registered on the Zanana beaches across the strait, and the 90mm anti-aircraft pieces are dug in around the harbour, their barrels pointing skyward at the dense tropical cloud that hangs over the island. On the 4th of July, the Japanese launch one of the heaviest air raids of the campaign. The radar operators pick up the incoming formations at long range, and the anti-aircraft batteries swing their guns onto the bearing as the first shapes appear low over the water. Edmund D. Hadley, a gun crewman with the 9th Defense Battalion, will remember the date for the rest of his life, not for the holiday it might have been, but because that was the day the planes fell. The coordinated fire of the 90mm and 40mm Bofors guns creates a wall of fragmentation over the beachhead, the shells exploding in precise brown-black puffs that bracket the Japanese formations. 13 of 16 attacking aircraft are shot down in a single engagement, the crippled bombers cartwheeling into the jungle, trailing long plumes of black smoke. Over the next month, the defense battalions repel 159 separate raids and claim 46 kills, their gunners sleeping in shifts beside their weapons, the muzzles of the guns so hot after each action that the paint blisters and curls away. But the most surprising contribution of the defense battalions in the New Georgia campaign comes from their armored elements. M3 Stuart light tanks from the 9th, 10th, and 11th Defense Battalions are assigned to spearhead the bloody, slow drive to Munda Airfield. the tanks grinding forward through mud and jungle that would swallow infantrymen whole. Captain Robert W. Blake, a tank commander who earns the Navy Cross in this fighting, describes the brutal intimacy of the work. He drops down behind the periscopic sight, levels the dot at the black slot of a Japanese bunker, and presses the firing switch. 37mm canister round strips away the concealing branches and leaves them raw and broken. Then a high explosive shell follows, cracking the fortification, and the machine guns cut down the survivors as they flee. The tanks advance yard by yard, each gain measured in expended ammunition and the burned-out hulks of bunkers. By the 4th of August, the surviving armor clanks onto Munda Point airfield, littered with wrecked Japanese aircraft and cratered by weeks of bombing. 3,000 miles northeast of the Solomons, the Central Pacific Campaign opens in November 1943 with a fury that surpasses even Guadalcanal. The 2nd Marine Division storms Betio Island in Tarawa Atoll on the 20th, and within 4 days the assault units have taken 4,000 casualties while annihilating a Japanese garrison that fought almost to the last man. The beach is a charnel house of blasted palm logs, smashed concrete, and the reek of death that hangs over the lagoon. On the 24th, as the last organized resistance collapses, Colonel Norman E. True's 2nd Defense Battalion wades ashore through the debris to relieve the exhausted infantrymen. True's battalion moves with the urgent precision that has become the hallmark of these units. The 90mm anti-aircraft guns are emplaced around the captured airstrip, now named Hawkins Field for a Marine lieutenant killed in the assault, and the radar sets are unpacked and calibrated. The SCR-268 fire control radars, temperamental devices that demand constant attention from the specialists who operate them, are positioned to form an integrated detection net that can vector searchlight beams onto approaching aircraft. Colonel True's men know that the Japanese will not abandon so significant a base without a fight, and they are ready when the first retaliatory raids materialize. Between November and January, Betio endures 19 organized air attacks and countless harassing raids by lone night bombers nicknamed Washing Machine Charlie for the rhythmic thrumming of their engines. The air defense system that True's battalion creates at Tarawa represents a quantum leap from the desperate, visually directed anti-aircraft fire of Wake Island 2 years earlier. Radar operators now feed target coordinates to a central direction center, which computes firing solutions and electronically transmits them to the gun batteries. Searchlights, some directed by radar and some operating independently, can pick up approaching aircraft at a slant range of 60,000 feet and hold them in their cones of blue-white light. When the 90mm guns open fire, the shells burst with mathematical precision around the silhouetted bombers. Once the Japanese manage to evade detection entirely, the bombs fall short, mistaking the white beach for the runway and blasting the coastal gun positions on neighboring Beriki. The Defense Battalion adjusts its coverage and does not lose another raid to the darkness. Far out of the battle line, on garrison duty in the Ellis Islands, a private named Donald T. Regan serves in the 11th Defense Battalion and reflects on the peculiar anonymity of this war. The defense battalions protect the airstrips that the bombers use, guard the harbors where the convoys form, and man the anti-aircraft guns that shield the rear areas. Regan feels that his unit is doing quite a bit to protect those who are doing the more public fighting. And the observation captures something essential about the experience of these men. They fight in the background noise of the Pacific War, their victories measured in the bombers that do not reach the runway and the ships that do not sink, while the headlines go to the assault divisions and the carrier pilots. The Central Pacific Offensive accelerates through the winter of 1944. 5 Amphibious Corps uses Marine reconnaissance troops and Army infantry to seize Majuro Atoll in the Marshall Islands on the 30th of January, then pivots immediately to strike 2 objectives inside Kwajalein Atoll. The fighting is ferocious but brief, and by early February, the captured islands are being transformed into forward operating bases. The 1st Defense Battalion, now under Colonel Hone, arrives in the Marshalls and sets up its guns at Roy Namur and Majuro, the crews positioning 90mm anti-aircraft pieces in some of the 50 or more craters that American bombs and shells have gouged in the Japanese runways. The irony is not lost on the gunners. The destruction wrought by the bombers has dug their fighting positions for them. The 10th and 15th Defense Battalions fan out across the captured atolls, occupying Kwajalein Island and the islands of Eniwetok at the western limit of the Marshall Group. The rapidity of the deployment is what matters now. The ability of these specialized units to land, set up their weapons, and establish a functioning air defense network within hours. CCBs bulldoze new runways across the coral, and the Defense Battalion gunners dig in alongside them, their anti-aircraft batteries forming a protective dome over the construction crews. The transformation is almost instantaneous. An island that was a Japanese fortress 24 hours earlier becomes an American airbase, its anti-aircraft defenses already operational, its searchlights probing the night, its radar sets rotating in their canvas-covered bunkers. The victory in the Marshalls extends American air power 2,500 miles closer to Japan. From Eniwetok and Kwajalein, the bombers can now strike at the Caroline Islands, the Mariana Islands, and eventually the Japanese home islands themselves. The defense battalions that once huddled on Midway and Wake, praying that their primitive 3-inch guns would be enough, have become something far more formidable. Professional anti-aircraft artillerymen, who can land on a hostile shore and throw up an umbrella of fire within hours of the first assault wave. A combat correspondent with the 1st Marine Division, Technical Sergeant George McMillan, describes the initial lodgement on Guadalcanal as a stretch of beach and acres of coconut grove, but the battalions have transformed hundreds of such anonymous beaches into the foundations of an aerial empire. The war has gone beyond the original concept of static island defense. The defense battalions now land with the assault waves, fight alongside rifle companies, and bring their guns to bear on targets that the pre-war planners never imagined: tanks spearheading jungle offensives, searchlights illuminating enemy bunkers, 90mm anti-aircraft pieces engaging landing barges on dark rivers. The evolutionary line that began in 1939, with Colonel Barrett and Colonel Pepper drafting tables of organization in Washington, has reached its mature form. A versatile, hard-hitting combined arms force capable of seizing and holding any piece of ground the Pacific Campaign requires, and defending it against anything the Japanese can throw against it. The road ahead will lead to the Marianas, to the Philippines, and ultimately to Okinawa. But the pattern is now set. The defense battalions have become the anti-aircraft shield of the Pacific War. The Mariana Islands campaign opens on the 15th of June 1944, when 5 amphibious corps storms the volcanic beaches of Saipan. Behind the assault divisions, the 17th and 18th Defense Battalions move ashore to emplace their 90mm guns around the captured airfields, their tables of organization already reshaped by the April redesignation order that stripped most of the Corps' defense battalions of their coastal artillery tubes and renamed them anti-aircraft artillery battalions. The old 5-inch guns, the weapons that had broken the cruiser squadron off Wake Island in 1941, have been left in rear area depots. The battalions now carry only the tools of air defense: the heavy 90mm M1A1s, the rapid-firing 40mm Bofors, the interlocking net of searchlights, and the temperamental but increasingly capable fire control radars. When the assault shifts south to Guam on the 21st of July, the 9th and 14th Defense Battalions still wear the old designation, but their 155mm coastal pieces have remained aboard the transports. They too are in everything but name: anti-aircraft artillery units. Lieutenant Colonel Archie F. O'Neill's 9th Defense Battalion lands in the first echelon at Agate Bay, supporting the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, while Lieutenant Colonel William F. Parks brings the 14th ashore on the Red Beaches with the 3rd Marine Division. Japanese mortar and machine gun fire rakes the landing zones. The gun crews manhandle the 90mm carriages through chest-deep water and winch them onto the sand with traction cables still spooling from the LST ramps. Within hours, the anti-aircraft pieces are dug in around the eastern edge of the beachhead, their barrels elevated toward the overcast sky. The Marines of the Seacoast Artillery Groups have been retrained as riflemen, and they push into the jungle shoulder to shoulder with the infantry, killing or capturing the first of the 10,000 Japanese stragglers who will hide in the island's northern limestone caves. By the time the island is declared secure in August, the battalion's role has fractured into a dozen simultaneous duties, manning the 90mm batteries that arc across the high ground above Asan and Agat, patrolling the ravines for holdouts, and herding thousands of displaced Chamorro civilians into improvised camps, where the corpsmen treat their shrapnel wounds. In the spring of 1945, the African-American 52nd Defense Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel David W. Silvey, arrives on Guam to reinforce the garrison. These Marines trained at the segregated Montford Point camp and organized into one of the 2 black battalions authorized since the Revolution, take over sectors of the anti-aircraft defense line with the same equipment and the same mission as their white counterparts, though they will remain in segregated barracks. The radar operators, who sit before the amber scopes of the SCR 584 sets, now track no serious enemy air threat. The Japanese have all but abandoned the Marianas sky. Instead, the fire control net that has matured since the desperate improvisations of Midway and Tarawa becomes a training ground, a quiet but fully functional shield waiting for an attack that never comes. 1,100 miles northwest of Guam, the final act of the Defense Battalion story unfolds on the island of Okinawa. On the 1st of April 1945, the 1st Provisional Anti-Aircraft Artillery Group splashes ashore with the 10th Army's invasion force. The group is a composite of 4 former defense battalions, the 2nd, 5th, 8th, and 16th, now wholly remade as AAA units and placed under the operational control of the Army's 53rd Anti-Aircraft Artillery Brigade. The landing beaches at Hagushi are lightly contested, but the sky above them quickly fills with a new and terrifying weapon. The kamikaze, a piloted bomb that deliberately steers itself into the radar picket ships and transport vessels anchored offshore. The 90mm and 40mm gun crews, who dig their emplacements into the coral terraces above the Yontan and Kadena airfields, know that their mission is no longer to protect their own positions, but to throw a wall of steel between the suicide attackers and the fleet. The 8th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, whose lineage traces back to the coconut log emplacements of Tutuila and Wallace, reaches Nargo on the Motabu Peninsula on the 13th of April. A veteran of the unit, James H. Powers, later recalls that the battalion received credit for a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, a Betty that tried to slip through the defensive net during a night raid. The kill is a product of the integrated air defense system that has been evolving since the first temperamental SCR-268 sets were bolted to the decks off Iceland. Radar operators feed range and azimuth data to a central direction center which computes firing solutions and transmits them by telephone to the gun batteries. The same procedure that Colonel True's 2nd Defense Battalion had pioneered on Betio. By now, the system is routine. The gunners no longer fire visually at the dull glint of wings, but track a flickering pip on a glass screen and trust the mathematics. The 5th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion sets up near the bomb-scarred runways of Yontan Kadena by the 6th of May. During a series of raids that press the air defense network to its limit, the battalion claims 1 kill and assists in another, its 40mm Bofors pumping out a relentless stream of tracers into the paths of diving single-engine fighters with fixed undercarriages and piloted rocket bombs called Okas. The anti-aircraft gunners learn to weight their fire toward the leading edge of the oncoming formation, forcing the kamikaze pilots to choose between colliding with the barrage or breaking off their run. The ferocity of the suicide attacks tests the very design principle that Colonel Robert H. Pepper and Colonel Charles D. Barrett had laid down in 1939. A battalion small enough to be expeditionary but dense enough in firepower to saturate an airspace. The mathematics hold. By the time the island is secured in June, the provisional group has helped protect the airfields that will stage the bombers for the final campaign against the Japanese home islands. 900 miles south of Okinawa on the island of Tinian, another former defense battalion stands at its station, the 17th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, which had moved from Saipan to Tinian in August of 1944, now guards Northfield, sprawling complex of runways carved from the cane fields by CB bulldozers. It is from Northfield, in the early morning darkness of the 6th of August 1945, that a B-29 named the Enola Gay lumbers down the coral-surfaced runway and lifts into the pale Pacific sky. The anti-aircraft gunners who watch it go do not know its destination, but they understand the significance of the takeoff. The long arc of the defense battalions has stretched from the desperate sandspits of Wake and Midway, through the malarial jungles of Guadalcanal and New Georgia, across the blood-soaked reef at Tarawa and the bomb craters of the Marshalls, to this moment on the threshold of the enemy's home waters. Their war ends 8 days later when the last Japanese air raid of the conflict turns back short of Okinawa, and the 8th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion tracks its retreating blips on the radar scope in silence. The defense battalions leave behind a record that is, in essence, the story of the Pacific War in miniature. They were born from a strategic paradox. The Marine Corps needed to project power across the world's largest ocean, but the American public would only fund defensive units. Within that constraint, Barrett, Pepper, and the officers of the Fleet Marine Force built an organization that could land on an undefended atoll, erect a fortress within 3 days, and hold it against attacks from the sea and the air. When the war went on the offensive, the battalions evolved, shedding their coastal artillery, mounting their anti-aircraft guns on forward beachheads, integrating their radars into the complex nervous system of the carrier task forces. The same physical vulnerability that defined them in 1939. Their light construction and their lack of organic infantry became the very reason they could deploy so rapidly from island to island, turning each newly captured airfield into a protected base for the next leap forward. The men who served in these units rarely saw their names in the newspapers, but the B-29 crews who flew from the Marianas, the fighter pilots who scrambled from Henderson Field, the infantrymen who crouched in the landing craft off Rendova and Okinawa, they understood that the defense battalions had built the invisible wall that made all the rest possible. We have traced the path of these specialized Marines from the drawing boards of Washington to the final radar station on Tinian, but countless individual stories remain untold. If you or someone in your family served in a defense battalion on Wake, Midway, Samoa, Guadalcanal, or any of the other islands scattered across the Pacific, we would be honored to hear your memories. Please share them in the comments below. Whether they are tales of combat, of the grinding monotony of garrison duty, or simply a photograph tucked into an old album. And if this telling of an often overlooked chapter of the Pacific War has resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Your support helps keep these histories alive for the next generation. Thank you for watching.